All right, well, hello, my name is Christopher Scott, and I serve as a small groups pastor of a local church. And in this video, I'm going to give you a teaching on a guy named Rehoboam from the Old Testament, right? The title of this message is Tough Lessons from a Tough Situation, a message about the man Rehoboam, right? So the church I serve at, we recently did a series, Bad Boys of the Bible, good lessons from Bad Boys of the Bible, and this was part of my message that I gave at our church that I wanted to put here on YouTube as well to serve and help people as well. Or maybe you're studying Rehoboam or doing a little devotional in Kings and you came across his name and Googled him and wanted to learn more about him. This is going to be a teaching about Rehoboam, more specifically some good lessons we can learn from a tough situation that Rehoboam had. So J. Vernon McGee, when he talks about the man Rehoboam and the story that's there in 1 Kings, he talks about how this is a dark blot in the history of Israel. Rehoboam was the son of Solomon, who was the son of David, right? He was from the king line. He had all the promises, all the good things going for him, but makes some bad decisions, gives some bad news, and has some bad faith that results in splitting the kingdom with Israel in the north and Judah in the south, right? So, and his effects are seen not just in the Old Testament, but all the way through to the New Testament as well, when Paul talks about how he is he's a Hebrew of Hebrews, from the tribe of Benjamin. He's being very specific that, hey, he's part of the southern tribe under King David, Solomon, and Rehoboam, of which the 10 northern tribes all separated, as we'll read in this story. They get assimilated and no one really knows where they went. But Judah and Benjamin are the true tribes of Israel that stay there, and Paul talks about that in his letter to the Philippians. So Rehoboam has lasting effects, not just in the Old Testament, but all the way through to the New Testament as well. So in this video, I'm going to talk about three main topics, right? And it's about a tough lessons from a tough situation that Rehoboam was in. There's going to be three topics. There's tough decisions that Rehoboam has to make. He has a tough decision. There's tough news, and then a tough faith, right? So first, I want to just simply read the passage to you. I'm going to read a couple passages to you. I'm going to read first from 1 Kings 12, 1 through 19, then 2 Chronicles 11, 5, 2 Chronicles 12:1, and then 1 Kings 14, 22 through 24. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm just going to read the text. I'm reading from the New Living Translation if you want to follow along. Okay, and it says in 12:1, 1 Kings 12:1, Rehoboam went to Shechem where all Israel had gathered to make him king. When Jeroboam, son of Nebat, heard of this, he returned from Egypt, for he had fled to Egypt to escape from King Solomon. The leaders of Israel summoned him, and Jeroboam and the whole assembly of Israel went to speak with Rehoboam. Your father was a hard master, they said. Lighten the harsh labor demands and heavy taxes that your father imposed on us. Then we will be your loyal subjects. Rehoboam replied, give me 3 days to think this over, then come back for my answer. So the people went away. Then King Rehoboam discussed the matter with the older men who had counseled his father, Solomon. What is your advice? He asked. How should I answer these people? The older counselors replied, if you're willing to be a servant to these people today and give them a favorable answer, they will always be your loyal subjects. But Rehoboam rejected the advice of the older men and instead asked the opinion of the young men who had grown up with him and were now his advisors. What is your advice? He asked them. How should I answer these people who want me to lighten the burdens imposed by my father? This young man replied, this is what you should tell those complainers, those who want a lighter burden. My little finger is thicker than my father's waist. Yes, my father laid heavy burdens on you, but I'm going to make them even heavier. My father beat you with whips, but I will beat you with scorpions. 3 days later, Jeroboam and all the people returned to hear Rehoboam's decision, just as the king had ordered. But Rehoboam spoke harshly to the people, for he rejected the advice of the older counselors and followed the counsel of his younger advisors. He told his people, my father laid heavy burdens on you, but I'm going to make them even heavier. My father beat you with whips, but I will beat you with scorpions. So the king paid no attention to the people. This turn of events was the will of the Lord, for it fulfilled the Lord's message to Jeroboam, son of Nebat, through the prophet Ahijah from Shiloh. When all Israel realized that the king had refused to listen to them, they responded, down with the dynasty of David. We have no interest in the son of Jesse. Back to your homes, O Israel. Look out for your own house, O David." So the people of Israel returned home, but Rehoboam continued to rule over the Israelites who lived in the towns of Judah. King Rehoboam sent Adoniram, who was in charge of the labor force, to restore order, but the people of Israel stoned him to death. When this news reached King Rehoboam, he quickly jumped into his chariot and fled to Jerusalem. And to this day, the northern tribes of Israel have refused to be ruled by a descendant of David. Okay, so that's the passage from 1 Kings chapter 12, verses 1 through 19. Now I'm going to jump over to 2 Chronicles 11, verse 5, that continues the story. Rehoboam remained in Jerusalem and fortified the various towns for the defense of Judah. And then in 2 Chronicles 12:1. But when Rehoboam was firmly established and strong, he abandoned the law of the Lord, and all of Israel followed him into sin. And then back to 1 Kings 14:22 through 24, where it says, "During Rehoboam's reign, the people of Judah did what was evil in the Lord's sight, provoking his anger with their sin, for it was even worse than that of their ancestors. For they also built for themselves pagan shrines and set up sacred pillars and Asherah poles on every high hill and under every green tree. There were even male and female shrine prostitutes throughout the land. The people imitated the detestable practices of the pagan nations the Lord had driven out from the land ahead of the Israelites." Okay? So that's God's word. 1 Kings 12, 1 Kings 14, and then 2 Chronicles 11 and 12 about Rehoboam. And so this is an important part in the kingdom of Judah, right? So Solomon has just died. Rehoboam is about to become king. And because of these decisions he makes, the news that he gives them, and the faith that he does but doesn't really have, it splits the kingdom, right? The 10 tribes stay in the north under Jeroboam, which starts with a J, Jeroboam in the north. And then 2 tribes stay in the south for Judah under Rehoboam. So that's how I remember it. Israel is in the south, J. Rehoboam in the, Israel in the north, J. And then Judah in the south, R for Rehoboam. That's how I remember it, okay? And so I'm going to give you some applicational outlines from these passages. So I'm going to first talk about tough decisions require, right? Tough decisions require 4 things. And Rehoboam has a tough decision here. Tough decisions require, first of all, time to think about them, right? Time to think about them. And we read here in verse 5, right? So Rehoboam is about to become king. All of the nation of Israel gathers here to make him king, but they say, hey, we have this one special request of you. Your father has been really hard on us. He's taxed us a lot, and he's required us to work a lot. We want you to lighten those burdens on us, right? And Rehoboam does something good, right? He says, give me 3 days to think this over, right? This is a bad boy. He's not always does everything right, but he does say, give me 3 days to think this over. And maybe in your own life, this is a good idea for you. If you have a tough decision, take time to think it over. I'm sure there's been times in your life where you felt a little irritated and angry and frustrated, and you're faced with a decision, and you just make a decision right there as you're irritated, angry, and frustrated. Or there might be other times where you're faced with a decision, but you say, you know what, I'm going to stop, I'm going to pray, I'm going to think about it, and I'm going to make a decision in a few days. Out of those 2 scenarios, which are the decisions you most likely have regrets about? The ones you did when you were angry and frustrated, or the ones where you took your time? Most likely you regret the ones where you made decisions when you were angry and frustrated. And so it's good to take time to think about your decisions. Take as much time as you need to think about them, just as Rehoboam does here in this passage, okay? The next principle, tough decisions require time to get good advice. Tough decisions require time to think about them, and tough decisions require time to get good advice. And we read about this here in this passage, right? Where Rehoboam has these people from Israel come to him. They say, you know what? You've worked us hard in the past. Give us a little less taxes, a little less work. Rehoboam says, give me 3 days to think it over. And then Rehoboam goes and he gets good advice from 2 different groups. He talks to the older counselors that had worked under his father Solomon, and then he talks to the younger counselors that he grew up with and that he was friends with, right? And it reminds me of NASCAR, right? These older counselors, they know what's going on. And if you watch NASCAR, the guys will talk about how there's 500 laps. They're going to go around and around and around 500 times. And the first, as they're getting started, the first couple hundred laps, you're just trying to make it around. Don't cause any trouble. Don't stir any issues or make anybody mad at you. Just keep things going, keep them smooth. And that seems to be what the older counselors know here, right? They say, okay, Rehoboam, you need a simple win. You need to just get going, become king, and you can figure these things out later, right? And so you need to get good advice. And that's the good advice that he gets from the older counselors, right? And Proverbs talks a lot about good counsel, right? Proverbs 11:14 says, without wise leadership, a nation falls. There is safety in having many advisors. 15:22 says, plans go wrong for lack of advice. Many advisors bring success. 24:6, so don't go to war without wise guidance. Victory depends on having many advisors, okay? And it reminds me of this story about this mom whose daughter was sick at home, and so the mom went to CVS to try to get some medication for the daughter, and she rushes in there fast, and she gets the medication, she comes out to her car, and she realizes she has locked her keys inside of her car. So she's frantic and panicked because her daughter's home alone. She's trying to get back home to take care of her daughter. So she goes inside the CVS, she gets a little hanger, and she goes and she's trying to unlock the door with the hanger, right? And this guy happens to walk up and he says, hey, I think I can help you with that. She says, oh, that'd be so great. I've been praying to God that he would help me, have someone help me. So the guy walks over, one pull, pop, unlocks the door with one pull. And so then the lady says, thank you, sir. I'm so grateful that you're able to help me. And she said, thank you, God, for helping me. And the guy says, it's interesting. I just happened to be walking by and you needed my help. And she goes, that's cool. Where were you walking from? Oh, I just got out of jail. And then the lady says, God, thank you for sending me a helper. And the lady says, well, sir, what were you in jail for? He says, grand theft auto. So that's just a story. When you want to get good advice, you want to get good help, right? So that's the principle here. Tough decisions require time to think about them. Tough decisions require time to get good advice, which Rehoboam did by getting good advice from the older counselors. Next, tough decisions require time to evaluate the best advice, right? Time to evaluate the best advice. Frank Boreham, who is a British writer, says that we make our decisions and that our decisions make us. And with that said, we have to evaluate the best advice for the decisions. And if you think about this, the older men, they said to make a change, right? These older counselors, they were loyal to King Solomon. They had served under him. They probably, appreciated him and respected him. Yet they're telling Rehoboam to do something different than what Solomon was doing, right? Yet Rehoboam, it says in the passage that Rehoboam rejected the advice of the older counselors. And when you come to tough decisions, you need to, figure out what it takes to make the right decision, right? Warren Wiersbe says, sometimes we forget our decisions, but our decision can never forget us because we reap what we sow, okay? So tough decisions require time to evaluate the best advice, time to think about them, those decisions, time to get good advice, but also time to evaluate the best advice. It reminds me of the story that I recently read about. The President of the United States, an old priest, a young mountain climber, and the world's smartest man were riding together on a private plane when it suddenly suffered engine trouble. The pilot scrambled from the cockpit saying, "We're going down, save yourselves." He then jumped out of the plane and activated his parachute. The 4 passengers looked around but found only 3 parachutes. The president took one and as he jumped said, "I must save myself for the sake of national security." The world's smartest man grabbed one and jumped, saying, "I'm an invaluable resource to the world and must save my intellect." The old priest looked at the mountain climber and said, "Save yourself, my son. I've been in the Lord's service for 40 years and I'm not afraid to meet my maker." "No sweat, Padre," answered the young man. "The world's smartest man just jumped with my backpack." So, tough decisions mean that we need to get the best advice and evaluate the best advice, right? So tough decisions require time to think about them, time to get good advice, time to evaluate the best advice. And the last point here, tough decisions require time to find a way to serve, right? Tough decisions require time to find a way to serve. Rehoboam ignores the people's request here, right? It says that all of Israel had gathered to make him king. They all were there to make him king. They're ready to follow him. Yet it says the king paid no attention to the people, right? A literal way to translate it is the king did not listen to them, right? He didn't listen to them. He paid no attention, right? Both in his words and in his manner, the new king made it clear to the people that he was important and powerful, and they were unimportant and weak. A dangerous message indeed. Okay, that's from Warren Wiersbe, his commentary on 1st and 2nd Kings that I'll put down there. So, tough decisions require finding time to find a way to serve. And that's what the older counselors tell Rehoboam in 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 7. It says, if you are willing to be a servant of these people, they will be your loyal subjects forever, right? All you have to do is serve them, right? All you have to do is serve them. And if anything else, if Rehoboam would have just given in and said, okay, we'll do it. I'll make less taxes and less work. If that's his first act as a brand new king, the people are going to love him. Who doesn't want less taxes and less work, right? Even, no king wants to start out being unpopular. They all want to start out being loved and popular. If he would have just at least done that and been a servant, he could have kept the kingdom and kept the nation of Israel together, right? Jerry Bridges in his book, True Community, says, one of the beauties of servanthood is that it requires no special talent or spiritual gifts, right? The beauties of servanthood is that it requires no special talent or spiritual gifts, right? So we want to do that, is to have that attitude of service. And that's something that our Lord Jesus Christ was. He was a servant. That's why he came here. In Luke chapter 22, it talks about the reason that Jesus came to the earth, right? Luke chapter 22, verses 24 through 27, talk about how there are these two disciples that are kind of arguing back and forth with each other, and about who's going to be the greatest. And in one gospel story, the mom even gets involved in talking about it. And this is what Jesus tells these disciples about power and influence, right? He's talking about power. It says, Luke chapter 22, verses 24 through 27 says, Jesus told them, in this world the kings and great men lord power over their people, yet they are called friends of the people. But among you it will be different. For those who are the greatest among you should take the lowest rank, and the leaders should be like a servant. Who is more important, the one who sits at the table or the one who serves? The one who sits at the table, of course, but not here. For I am among you as the one who serves. That's what Jesus tells his disciples about how he is here as the one who serves. He is the servant that came to give his life, the sacrifice for our sins, so that we can be made right in God's eyes. So Philippians chapter 2, Paul talks about what this means that Jesus became as a servant. He gives more explanation about it. So in Luke 2, 6 through 8, it says, though he was God, talking about Jesus, though Jesus was God, he did not think of equality with God as something to cling to. Instead, he gave up his divine privileges. He took the humble position of a slave and was born of a human being. When he appeared in human form, he humbled himself in obedience to God and died a criminal's death on the cross. Okay? That's what Jesus did and what Paul talks about then. And if you're familiar with the Navigators ministry, they got lots of great resources, lots of great small group studies, lots of one-on-one discipleship studies and things like that. The Navigators was started by a guy named Dawson Trotman, right? Who was a great servant of people. And there once is a story that I recently read. Years ago, during a visit to Taiwan, Dawson Trotman, founder of the Navigators, hiked with a Taiwanese pastor back into some of the mountain villages to minister the word of God to the national Christians. Because the roads and trails were wet, they returned home wet and cold, their shoes covered with mud. Much later, someone asked this Taiwanese pastor what he remembered most about Dawson Trotman. Without hesitation, he replied, he cleaned my shoes. When Trotman and the pastor returned that afternoon, they removed their shoes at the doorway, as was customary. The pastor went on into the kitchen to prepare some tea. How surprised he was when he returned a few minutes to see Trotman sitting on the floor with a small stick, a piece of cloth, and some water, cleaning his shoes. Such a spirit of servanthood marked Dawson Trotman throughout his life. He died as he lived, actually giving his life to rescue someone from drowning. That's what it means to be a servant. The Dawson Trotman, this guy that oversees a lot of people, a lot of ministry, was sitting there with a cup of water, a stick, and a cloth, cleaning this pastor's shoes, okay? So, tough decisions require time to think about them. Tough decisions require time to get good advice. Tough decisions require time to evaluate the best advice. And tough decisions require time to find a way to serve, right? That's the first part here in our application about Rehoboam, okay? Next, we're going to talk about tough news. So Rehoboam has this tough decision that he needs to make, right? And he's thinking about and working through this tough decision. Then he makes his decision and he has to give the news, right? So he has to give the news. Tough news requires, first of all, giving it in person. Tough news requires giving it in person, right? And that's what we read about here that Rehoboam does. Again, it's something that he does well. 1 Kings 12:12. Okay, 1 Kings 12:12. So the people of the nation of Israel has gathered to make Rehoboam king. They say, you know what, we have this one thing we want to ask of you, less taxes and less money, or less taxes and less work. So Rehoboam says, give me 3 days to talk this over and think about it, and I'll come back to you with my decision. Rehoboam talks to the older counselors and the younger counselors. He listens to the younger counselors, but what he does is he goes back and he meets with the people in person, right? So he does this good, at least at first, right? It says 3 days later, Jeroboam and all the people returned to hear Rehoboam's decision, just as the king had ordered. So Rehoboam, he doesn't send an escort to tell him his news. He doesn't send an email or a tweet or a letter or something like that. He shows up there in person and talks to them. This is something he does well. Yet, this is something he also does poorly a few verses later in chapter 12, verses 18 and 19. So the people say, we don't like your answer. See you later, Rehoboam. We're going to keep ourselves as our own unique nation in northern Israel, okay? And make our own 10 tribes. And this is what Rehoboam does. King Rehoboam sent Adoniram, who was in charge of the labor force, to restore order, but the people of Israel stoned him to death. When this news reached King Rehoboam, he quickly jumped into his chariot and he fled to Jerusalem. And to this day, the northern tribes of Israel have refused to be ruled by a descendant of David, right? So Rehoboam tries to enforce his decision, and this doesn't go very good for a couple reasons. Number one, Rehoboam sends someone on behalf of him to try to enforce his decision. Maybe you've been in this situation, right? I know I have, where I'm the recipient of some bad news. Someone makes a decision over here, then they tell this person over here to give me that bad news. As the recipient of it, you don't really take it very well when you know this person is just the messenger sent by that person to give the bad news, okay? The other part of it is being that person that's sent to give the bad news when it wasn't your decision, right? So neither kind of directions this is going very well, from Adoniram giving it or the people receiving it from Adoniram, right? And so there's ways that we can give bad news, right? And the baddest way to give bad news is a text message, right? In our modern days, it's easy to send text messages, but that's the worst way that we can give bad news, okay? We don't want to give bad news by text message. A bad way is email. A little bit better than text message, but it's still bad. A better way is by phone. At least you can talk by phone. But the best way to do it is in person. Just to simply meet in person and talk about it, okay? And so there's two pastors. I serve as a local pastor of a local church. And there's two pastors that are older guys that are retired that did ministry successfully for, 40 or 50 years, each of them. And so I talk to these guys a lot of times, right? I say, there's this situation at church. What do I do here? Or I'm kind of facing this. How do I talk to this person? Or what do I do? Or they're doing this and I need to correct it, but should I? And in the back of my mind, I'm always kind of thinking, okay, I hope he just tells me to send the guy a text message. Or I hope he tells me to write all my thoughts in an email, send it, close my computer, and then go on vacation for a week so I don't have to talk about it. But that's never how it works. You know what these two guys always tell me when I have difficulties and need to talk and need to work out something? You know what they always tell me? Christopher, take him out to lunch, man. I'm like, man, I don't want to go to lunch. Now I got to spend money about it too, right? But Christopher, take him to lunch. Take him to coffee. Talk to him about it, right? That's always what they do, is talk to the people in person and work it out. And the thing here that is interesting is as you talk out a decision, let's say you have tough news you got to give and you talk it out in person, don't expect just to share the news once and then be done with it, right? Don't just expect, I'm going to have a quick lunch, 30 minutes, we'll be done, it'll all be settled. Sometimes you're going to have to revisit the situation over and over and over with the person in lunch 1 week, 2 weeks later you have to have lunch again and work through it. This reminds me of when my wife and I were living in Texas. We lived in an apartment towards the back of the apartment complex where you had to drive through quite a ways to get to our apartment in the back. And I'm sitting there while I was in seminary. I just submitted my homework for Greek on my Greek class. And I'm sitting there and the building starts on fire on the other side. I think there was 12 different apartments in this building that we were in. And it starts on fire, so I get out and then I just see the building go up in flames, just burning. And so as I'm watching it burn, all the fire trucks show up with their sirens blazing. I see them putting water on it, and they're just dumping water on it. I mean, just thousands and thousands of gallons of water on this building. And it's in Texas, so it's windy, so it's just getting it going. And they finally get the fire out, but all these fire trucks are still just pouring water on it, just water after water after water. And like, guys, I think it's out. I don't think it needs any more water, but they just keep dumping water on it. And so what the apartment complex did, since we couldn't live in the burnt down building anymore, they put us in an apartment up near the entrance. So in order to get to our old apartment, you had to drive past our new apartment. And after you've watched your apartment burn down and heard all those sirens and been through that traumatic experience, the next time you hear a siren, there's some emotional reaction that goes on inside of you. So the very next day, we're in that new apartment, and I hear a siren. And so I peek outside, and there's a fire truck flying down the entrance, going to the back of the apartment complex. I thought, that's weird. The next day, I hear another siren. There's another fire truck flying down the road. And then the third day, I hear another siren. There's another fire truck flying down the road. And what had happened in Texas in November, it's pretty windy usually in the fall and in the spring in Texas. So the wind had stirred and it had found some hot coals at the bottom of that building and started the building back on fire 3 days in a row after it had already been extinguished and put out, right? And so that's kind of like these difficult conversations you're going to have in person. You can't just put a little water on it in person at a lunch and expect to be all done. You're going to have to come back time after time after time and continue to work through it, right? So tough news requires giving it in person. Tough news requires giving it in person. The next point there is tough news requires giving an explanation of your reasoning. Tough news requires giving an explanation of your reasoning. So 1 Samuel chapter 12, verse 13 through 14 says, "But Rehoboam spoke harshly to the people, for he rejected the advice of the older counselors and followed the counsel of his younger advisors. He told the people, 'My father laid heavy burdens on you, but I'm going to make them even heavier. My father beat you with whips, but I will beat you with scorpions.'" That's Rehoboam's message to them, right? Proverbs 15:1 says, "A gentle answer deflects anger, but harsh words make tempers flare." A gentle answer deflects anger, but harsh words make tempers flare. Rehoboam knew this statement from Proverbs. A gentle answer deflects anger, but harsh words make tempers flare. Rehoboam knew that because his dad is the one who wrote it and said it, right? Yet one commentary says, this thing that Rehoboam did, this probably was the most foolish thing that young Rehoboam could have done, right? He just tells them, "I'm the king, I'm going to tell you what to do, and you're going to take it because I'm the king," right? While people might not agree with you, right? If you at least explain your reasoning, give some reasoning behind it, why you made the decision, what's the reasoning behind it, why you wish you could decide something different, but you can't, it at least helps people understand the reasoning. Because in our culture, it's easy to ascribe false motives to people. Think, oh, you said that because of this and this and this. Well, no, that's not at all it, right? It's easy to do that in our culture, to think people say things for a certain reason. So tough news requires giving an explanation of your reasoning, which Rehoboam did not do at all. The third point here is that tough news requires giving time to talk it out. Tough news requires giving time to talk it out. It doesn't appear that there was any kind of Q&A time with Rehoboam. And to be honest, Rehoboam didn't have to give time to talk it out, right? He's the king. He can decide what he wants and says what he wants. So what Rehoboam did and how he went about it isn't necessarily wrong because he was the king and can do what he wants. But it definitely was not correct because it caused issues, right? There's definitely different ways he could have gone about it. So when giving tough news requires giving time to talk it out with people, right? And there's an important point here as we talk about giving time to talk it out. Just because you give time to talk it out, sometimes we think, oh, well, I'm going to have to, change my decision if I let us talk about it. Well, no, just the fact that you give time to talk it out doesn't mean your decision is going to change, but it does do two specific things. Number one, it tells people that you care enough to listen to them, right? You care enough about them to listen to them. Second, it helps them know that their struggles are understood, right? It provides healing and restoration for them because they know, all right, he's making this decision. He knows how I feel. I'm more able to accept it, at least because I know that he understands how I feel, right? So this is something you see the government do a lot of times when they're going to pave a new road or install a pipeline or something like that. They write out a proposal and a plan. They put it out there for everyone to see, and then they hold open town hall meetings or open forums that let people come and share their feelings and frustrations and disagreements. And a lot of times that doesn't really change maybe the decision of what's going to happen, but at least it gives people a chance to share those frustrations and make sure that they are known before the government moves forward, right? So we've talked about how there's tough decisions, there's tough decisions that need to be made. There's tough news that needs to be given. Now we want to talk about a tough faith, right? And a tough faith requires several personal things, right? And here I'm going to talk about personal faith related to Rehoboam. And some people might say, oh, you're just an American pastor. You Americans are all about your personal, individualistic Christianity. And for the sake of this one, yes, because Rehoboam is the king over all of Israel and Judah, and his personal faith will either positively affect the nation or negatively affect the nation. No one else's faith really matters. His is the most important. So that's why I'm going to talk about a personal, tough faith, right? So a tough faith requires personal devotion to the Lord. Tough faith requires a personal devotion to the Lord. And this is in 2 Chronicles 11, 13 through 17. So the two nations have split, right? Israel's now in the north under Jeroboam. Judah's in the south under Rehoboam. It says, but all the priests and Levites living among the northern tribes of Israel sided with Rehoboam. Kind of surprising. The Levites even abandoned their pasture lands and property and moved to Judah and Jerusalem because Jeroboam and his sons would not allow them to serve the Lord as priests. Jeroboam appointed his own priests to serve at the pagan shrines, where they worshipped the goat and calf idols he had made. From all the tribes of Israel, those who sincerely wanted to worship the Lord, the God of Israel, followed the Levites to Jerusalem, where they could offer sacrifices to the Lord, the God of their ancestors. This strengthened the kingdom of Judah, and for 3 years they supported Rehoboam, son of Solomon. For during those years they faithfully followed in the footsteps of David and Solomon. So Rehoboam starts off well, right? He becomes king, he has a good faith. Levites from the northern tribes aren't able to serve God like they want to, so they come to Judah in the south under Rehoboam. But Rehoboam moves away in his faith, right? 2 Chronicles 12:1 says, but when Rehoboam was firmly established and strong, he abandoned the law of the Lord, and all of Israel followed him into sin. And this is talked about in 1 Kings 14:22 through 24 also, where it says, during Rehoboam's reign, the people of Judah did what was evil in the Lord's sight, provoking his anger with their sin. For it was even worse than that of their ancestors. For they also built for themselves pagan shrines and set up sacred pillars and Asherah poles on every high hill and under every green tree. There was even male and female shrine prostitutes throughout the land. The people imitated the detestable practices of the pagan nations the Lord had driven from the land ahead of the Israelites. And if you've read 1st and 2nd Kings, you know that it talks about this evil king and this evil king and this evil king and this evil king. And Rehoboam is the first of many of those evil kings, right? And the leader is the most important spiritual person in any organizational church or house or whatever that might be. The leader is the most important, right? And spiritual. People are going to take their cues on the spiritual health from the leader, from no one else. So tough faith requires a personal devotion to the Lord. Tough faith requires a personal desire to not abuse God's promises. Personal faith requires a personal desire not to abuse God's promises. So I mentioned earlier that Rehoboam is the son of Solomon, and Solomon was the son of David. And David, unites the nation of Israel. We call it the United Kingdom. He unites the nation of Israel and has a strong kingdom there, and he has this place where he lives. And then David says, I'm going to build a palace for my king, for my God, the Ark of the Covenant. I'm going to build a temple. And then Nathan hears about it, and God speaks to Nathan about it and says, no, I don't think you want to build a temple. And so God gives these prophecies to Nathan, which Nathan then directs and gives to David. Okay, so God gives these prophecies to David through the prophet Nathan. 2 Samuel 7, verses 11 through 16. And the idea here is, the principle is, a tough faith requires personal desire to not abuse God's promises. Personal faith requires a personal desire to not abuse God's promises. Rehoboam's the king, and there had been promises that his family would be a king forever. That's talked about here in 2 Samuel chapter 7, verses 11 through 16. It says, furthermore, the Lord declares that he will make a house for you. He's talking to David, a dynasty of kings. For when you die and are buried with your ancestors, I will raise up one of your descendants, your own offspring, and I will make his kingdom strong. He is the one who will build a house, a temple for my name, and I will secure his royal throne forever. Your house and your kingdom will continue before me for all time, and your throne will be secure. Right? So this is a prophecy that God gives to David, and then David's family will be kings forever. And this includes Rehoboam, right? My grandpapa was given a prophecy that we would always be king, and I'm going to do whatever I want. So Rehoboam's kind of taking abuse of God's promises here, which is something we don't want to do. We even see this in the New Testament, right? In the book of Romans, in chapter 3 of Romans and chapter 6, Paul is arguing against some of these people that seem to have this belief that, God's grace is good and God's grace shows how great God is. So the more we sin, it shows God's grace because God forgives us. Therefore, the more we sin, therefore the better God looks, right? So the more sin, the better God looks because he has to have more grace, right? And so they're abusing the promise of God's grace and forgiveness. So this is something, a tough faith requires personal desire to not abuse God's promises, okay? So tough faith requires personal devotion to the Lord. Tough faith requires a personal desire to not abuse God's promises. And a tough faith requires personal devotion to God, which others can see. A personal devotion to God, which others to see, which is exemplified through the story of Tommy Lasorda, who is the former manager of the Los Angeles Dodgers. He has told a story about the day his team was scheduled to play on the road against the Cincinnati Reds. In the morning, Lasorda went to Mass. As he settled into his pew, the manager of the Reds, Johnny McNamara, happened to come into the same church and sit down in the same pew. The men eyed one another, but neither spoke. When Mass was over, they began to walk out when Lasorda discovered that the other manager had paused to light a candle. He figured that gave the Reds an edge. When he left, I went down and I blew that candle out, said Lasorda. All throughout the game, I kept hollering to him, hey Mac, it ain't gonna work. I blew it out. We clobbered him that day, 13-2. So personal faith, tough faith requires a personal devotion to God, which others can see. And that's something, sadly, that Rehoboam negatively had, right, for most of his time in the kingdom, right? So I read that passage from 2 Kings chapter 14, verses 22 through 24, that talks about the entire nation of Israel did evil in the Lord's sight. They built Asherah poles and pagan shrines on every high hill and under every green tree. And there were male and female shrine prostitutes at the temple. Okay, and these are, sadly, Deuteronomy talks about how God is giving the nation of Israel this land of Canaan, this promised land. God is giving it to them, and God wants the nation of Israel to drive out the pagan nations living there because they have these sacred pillars and Asherah poles and male and female shrine prostitutes. And here is the nation of Israel under Rehoboam. Just 500 years later, they've now are doing all the things that the pagan nations were doing, okay? So tough faith requires personal devotion to the Lord, a personal desire to not abuse God's promises, personal devotion to God which others can see, and lastly, tough faith requires personal dedication to follow God's direction when he speaks. A personal dedication to follow God's direction when he speaks, right? So I want to read to you from 1 Kings 12, 21 through 24. I haven't read this yet in our time for this video, but it talks about a personal dedication to follow God's direction when he speaks. So 1 Kings 12, 21. So this is after Jeroboam and the 10 tribes in the north have said, we're not going to side with Rehoboam, we're going to do our own thing. And then they pretty much just say, hey, we're doing our own thing, we're not coming around, sorry. And then Rehoboam tries to send Adoniram up there to enforce it. They stone Adoniram, and then Rehoboam goes back to Jerusalem. And this is what happens. When Rehoboam arrived at Jerusalem, he mobilized the men of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin, 180,000 select troops, to fight against the men of Israel and to restore the kingdom to himself. But God said to Shemaiah, the man of God, say to Rehoboam, son of Solomon, king of Judah, and to all the people of Judah and Benjamin, and to the rest of the people, this is what the Lord says. Do not fight against your relatives, the Israelites. Go back home, for what has happened is my doing. So they obeyed the message of the Lord and went home as the Lord had commanded. Okay? So think about this. How much pride Rehoboam had to have swallowed to listen to God and what God is telling him, and to turn back. And right, so that's what, personal dedication to follow God's direction when he speaks. And God can speak to us in different ways. He can speak to us through his word. He can speak to us through friends. He can speak to us by the conversations we have, and then the things that we read and things like that, right? So a tough faith requires personal devotion to the Lord, personal desire to follow God's promise, to not abuse God's promises, personal devotion to God which others can see, and a personal dedication to follow God's direction when he speaks. So I don't know about you, but when I look over some of these principles here, when we talk about a tough faith requires, or tough news requires, tough decisions require, it's easy for me to think about all the times I've done these wrong, honestly. But instead, we don't want to focus on the wrong things. We want to focus on the positive. We want to do what Paul writes about in Philippians, where he says, I'm forgetting the past and looking forward to what lies ahead. I press on. Philippians 3:13 through 14. So let's do that in our lives as Christians, that we take these principles in the tough situations we have, whether it's tough decisions we have, tough news we have to give, and a tough faith that we might need throughout those circumstances. So thanks for watching. I hope to catch you again on another video. If you like this video, you can subscribe up there and get updates on future videos, or you can find other videos about small groups I got up there, some other Bible studies over there, and some DVD studies over there. Thanks for watching, and I hope to catch you again soon in another video.